Good morning, everyone. I don't have a microphone, so I'm just going to speak loudly. Welcome to the Milton Council on Aging. I'm Christine Stanton, your director. And this morning, we have the pleasure of a return appearance from historian Susan Wilson, who has written, we had her in the fall presenting on the history of the Parker House in Boston. And today she's here to talk about the legacy of Susan Dimock. The Dimock Center in Roxbury is named after, and she has a fascinating story, so we're thrilled to welcome you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And can we get the lights so we can see the screen a little better? This is the important stuff, not me. Oh, fabulous. Thank you. Okay. So can everyone see the screen okay? And can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. Okay, let's get started. This is, in fact, my brand new book, Women and Children First, The Trailblazing Life of Susan Dimock, MD. And hopefully at the end of this hour, you will understand why the book has that name. But in the meantime, it may remain a bit of a mystery. When I'm talking, I don't use notes, I just talk. And therefore, if something comes up or is not clear, or if there's a question, just yell it out or raise your, well, I don't know if I'll see your hands. Yell it out because it's will be interactive. And periodically, I'll also ask you some things. Okay, let's get started. In order to understand Susan Dimock, who was a doctor in the 19th century in Boston, we need to know the world that she entered into. And so I like to start off by talking about this, which I call the sad state of healthcare in the middle of the 19th century. And the easiest way to show it is this. Okay, what's the problem here? There are no women, okay? It's all guys. I'm really sorry if you don't take it personally. Okay. By the way, it isn't all. This is the Mass Society for the Improvement of Medicine. It's all guys. I just want to show you, though. There's somebody up here you know. See this cute little guy, the second guy on the left? That's Oliver Wendell Holmes. And a lot of people think of him as a poet and hanging out with Longfellow and Emerson and all. But his day job, he was a doctor, and he taught at Harvard Med. So anyway, I think it's obvious to you why this is a problem. But to even, the basic thing is that the medical profession was closed to women. It didn't mean that some women didn't sneak in the back door, because women have always done that. But all the major medical schools were not co-ed, were closed to women. Every once in a while, some individual might be let in, and she'd sit in the back of the room and be very quiet. But in general, this was it, which meant that all the experiments, all the experience were men dealing with men. And if there were any problems or diseases that were particularly for women, there was little to no understanding. To give you an example of this, this is from a 19th century medical textbook. How to give a woman a physical exam. This is real, okay? No wonder they didn't know what was going on, okay? So I've even seen in other medical textbooks from the 1850s and 60s, the guy is not only, she's fully clothed, he's actually looking in the other direction because he doesn't want to embarrass her by seeing her. So little was known about women's ailments, very, very little. Now, it wasn't that we didn't have a great medical school. Okay? Harvard Med was in fact one of the most prestigious, back then and is to this day, prestigious medical schools in the United States. It was in a different place from nowadays. If you look at this, this is the Charles River, and this is where Mass General Hospital is. I don't know if you know the Ether Dome, but that's where it was. And you'll see right here it says Medical College. Harvard Med used to be right next to it. At that time, in the 19th century, the Charles River was tidal, which meant that it had high tides and low tides. So if you look at the picture in the upper right, you'll see Harvard Med is the building on the right. It's on pilings, and so is Mass General. And so during high tide, the water of the Charles River would come up to that, and I've seen images of patients being brought in on a boat to the front door to get in. So that's where they were located, and that was the center of medicine in Boston. Now, the woman who decided she wanted to change this was from Germany. Her name was Marie Zakrzewska. I don't know if anyone here is Polish, but only Poles seem to know how to pronounce that correctly.
You did. Zakrzewska.
Actually, my mother was Polish. But good, thank you. Anyway, her friends found it so difficult to pronounce that they just called her Dr. Zach. Anyway, she was born in Berlin, even though she was a Polish family. And from a very young age, she had an interest in healthcare. And she actually said she wanted to become a doctor. But Berlin, like in the United States, they said, women can't be doctors. Only men can be doctors. You can, however, be what? Not even a nurse then. That wasn't quite a profession. Midwife, yeah. Nursing wasn't quite a profession at that. We'll get into that. Anyway, so she studied midwifery. She did so very, very well that she ended up at the age of 22 heading a midwife school in Berlin. But she wanted more. And one of her male advisors, who realized she was brilliant and really could, if given the chance, could become a doctor, said, you need to go to America. I think there's going to be more chances there for a woman to come into medicine. So she did. She immigrated. She and her sister came to the United States. They went to New York, and they bumped into Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell is, if you've ever heard of a historic woman, this is probably the one you've heard of who's a doctor. She managed to sneak in a back door, get a medical degree in an all-male college, and became the first professional woman doctor in the United States. Her sister then went to medical school, and the two of them, Elizabeth and Emily, decided they wanted to open a hospital in New York where women doctors treated women patients because they realized this was a really serious need. At the time, there were 55,000 male doctors in the United States and 300 women. So some women had managed to sneak through, but not anything compared to the number of guys. Now, what happened was Marie Zakrzewska, the midwife, met them, began working with them, and they realized how talented she was and how bright she was and that she should become a doctor. So she worked with them and helped them set up the hospital and fundraise. And they also managed to get her into a medical school, which is now called Western Reserve. She went, was the only girl sitting in the back of the room, studied, excelled, did a great job, graduated, and then all the guys there said, that was a mistake, we're not letting any more women in. So they'd let one in and then they let her go, okay? So, but she got her MD. So she was in New York, and the Blackwell sisters said, we hear that there's a whole lot of people up in Boston who are progressive and rich. Why don't you go up there and see if perchance we can get some fundraising done in Boston, so you'll be our Boston person. So Zakrzewska came up, and she met a lot of wealthy, progressive people. And she decided that she wanted to actually practice as a doctor in Boston. So she said, what do you need to do to be a doctor? Well, I've got the MD, I've got some experience, but all the male doctors have a horse and carriage. So she bought a used carriage and a used horse. Well, I don't know what a used horse is. Anyway, she bought the two of them so that she could go out on house calls, which was a way to make a living. But she had more ambition than that. And a lot of the people in Boston, even though they knew she was technically tied to New York, said, why don't you do something here? Why don't you create something like the Blackwell sisters did in New York in Boston? And she said, I think I'm going to do that. So she went ahead, despite her father. Now, there were men who were very, very much, supportive of women to become into medicine, but a lot of them were not, especially a lot of the male doctors. And her dad was not a supportive guy. In a very infamous letter he wrote to her from Berlin, he wrote, if you were a young man, I could not find words to express my satisfaction and pride in respect to your medical career. But you were a woman, a weak woman, and all that I can do for you is to grieve and to weep. Oh, my daughter, return from this unhappy path. Okay, so we'll run into more supportive dads later, okay, but not Marie's. So, with the support of these wealthy progressive people in Boston, which included both men and women, she decided to set up the counterpart to what the Blackwells had done in New York. So she created the second hospital in the United States where women doctors, the few that were there, treated women patients. Where she set it up, now it's already been mentioned that we're talking about the thing that was the New England Hospital for Women and Children today is called the Dimock Center. We'll eventually find out how that happened. But it's in Roxbury today, but the original hospital was in downtown Boston. You know where the Charles Playhouse and Blue Man Group are? Yeah. Within a spit of that, okay? So it was a little rented building down there. And what she wanted to do there, okay, was first of all, make sure that women doctors treated women patients, because there were a certain number of things that some of the women patients might have very, very dreaded diseases, but they would say, oh, I could not go to a man for that. You know, it's one thing to fix your hand, it's another thing to fix other women's parts. The second thing she wanted to do was to have a place where women could have hands-on experience. And her idea was, whenever a woman manages to get into school and get her MD, virtually all the med schools in the United States had no hands-on experience. Even Harvard was completely book learning, okay? So you could get your MD and never have touched a human body. So she wanted to make sure that women who had gotten into, there were a couple of also kind of so-so women's medical schools that were just not as good as the guys, but there were a couple of those. And she said, okay, if you graduate from there, I want you to come here and we have real people here that I want you to work on. So it would be a place where people would get hands-on practical experience. She also said, you know, nursing isn't really a profession yet. It's something people kind of do if they're desperate and they don't have any other kind of money, and we'll get more into that later. We need to train professional nurses because it's great to have a good doctor, but if you don't have a nurse to follow up, what's going to happen? So these were all the things she wanted to create when she created the New England Hospital for Women and Children. Now, any people know history here? What had started just 1 year before this happened? Civil War, yeah. So it's in the middle of the Civil War that she's setting up this hospital. Now, there were supporters, but immediately there were people who came out and said, wait a second, women shouldn't be doctors, okay? There was this theory in the 19th century of the separate spheres, that the women's sphere was the domestic sphere. You stay at home, you do things at home, you cook, you clean, take care of the kids, you take care of your husband, and then there's the public sphere, which is work and money and travel and all that kind of stuff, but never the twain shall meet. And women shouldn't go into that sphere. And therefore, a lot of guys said, you know, not only should women not be in the public, but they shouldn't be in medicine, okay? So one of my favorites is a guy named Horatio Storer, who warned, you're going to love this, about that uncertain equilibrium that varying from month to month in each woman unfits her from taking those responsibilities which are to control the question of life and death. Okay? All right, so that was on the negative side. He wasn't the only one, but he's one of my favorites. However, lots of support from progressive men and women. And it wasn't just cash. A lot of it was gifts. This is from one of their annual reports. Mrs. Weld, do you know that name? Yeah. We once had a governor. The Welds actually are one of the oldest families in New England. They arrived here back in 1635, so they've been around a long time. But she donated cooking pears. Other people gave linen, apples, turkey for Thanksgiving. I love Miss Carey at the end. She gave pamphlets, old copies of the Atlantic Monthly, and 12 monthly parts of every Saturday. So all kinds of gifts that weren't necessarily money, but also there were people who gave cash. One of them was a woman named Mrs. Robert Gould Shaw. Does anyone know that name? Okay. All right. Probably you know it because of this guy. Okay, this was her son, Robert Gould Shaw Jr., who led the famous, this is the statue across from the State House. He led the famous 54th Regiment, which was the first all-black free regiment to fight in the Civil War. And he was white and the regiment was black. But this is also, to this day, considered the best piece of public art in Boston. Anyway, his mom, their family was progressive, one of those progressive rich families. They were abolitionist. They believed in women's rights, and they had a lot of money. Okay, so here is the context for my biography subject coming in. Susan Dimock was not from Boston. She was actually from North Carolina. Here's a picture of her at age 20. Lovely young woman. Anyone here from North Carolina? Yes, where are you from? Asheville. Oh, you're on the left side. Yeah, okay. Okay, she was from the right side. Okay, so some of you probably know the Outer Banks. And so if you look out here, you can see the Outer Banks. And then if you go in, you'll see this river and it says Washington. That isn't Washington, D.C., it's Washington, N.C. It was actually the first Washington in the United States. And because this was on a river, here's a close-up of the same thing, of the Pamlico River coming in, and then here's Washington. It was a really, really important seaport, a vital seaport. This is an image of what it looked like. Susan was born back in 1847. So this is what it looked like in the 40s and the 50s. And we imagine that even though she was from a tiny town, there were only like 3,000 people living there, but that she saw these ships coming in from Boston, New York, the West Indies, Europe, and maybe dreamed of a bigger world or something more than the little tiny town she lived in. Now, Susan was a weird kid. Okay, she was an only child. Her dad was from Maine. Her mother was a Southerner. She was from North Carolina. And in the South at that time, it was more than the extreme women's sphere and men's sphere. They basically didn't believe in this area that girls should be educated at all. There was no school, no primary school or primary school that girls could go to. In fact, they had no public schools there at the time. And her mom noticed that Susan wanted to learn a lot and she wanted to read books. And her mom had been a teacher, which was a career that was okay for women. And her mom said, well, I guess I have to teach her because she really, really wants to learn, even though little girls aren't supposed to want to do that. And so what happened was her mom realized after tutoring her at home, it was like, it would be much better if she had classmates. That would be much more to have people to learn with and be around her, even some competition. So what her mom did was she created a female school so Susan could have classmates. And this is an ad in the local paper, which curiously was run by Susan's dad. And Mrs. Dimock must have had some skill. We're talking about a one-room schoolhouse. She's the only teacher. And this is what she's offering. Reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, grammar, history, natural philosophy, chemistry, botany, piano, and guitar. Okay? So I guess Susan's mom was a great role model for her in getting things done. So she got a bunch of girls. Susan continued her education and learned a whole lot, which was, again, unusual for the era and the area. Now, conveniently, okay, the Dimocks had another job, which was they lived in a hotel and they ran the hotel, the Lafayette Hotel. So her dad's running the paper, her mom's running a school, they're also with their aunt running a hotel, and directly across the street lived this guy. He was the town doctor. He had a fabulous name, Solomon Sampson Satchwell. You can't, you can't buy a name like that. Okay? So he was across the street, and Susan discovered him, and not only did she love the idea of learning, but she had this notion that medicine was really interesting, and that she might want to become a doctor. Satchwell noticed this, and when Susan was just like 10 and 11 years old, he would invite her over, give her books, and let her go out with him on house calls. So she became his assistant when she was like 11 years old. Okay, so again, a weird kid. People remember Susan like this. Like she would go to school, do all her studies, finish her homework, and then go and sit under a tree and read medical texts for fun. Now, you may notice that medical text is in Latin. So Susan learned Latin so she could read the medical text for fun. Okay? So now, I mentioned that she was born in 1847. So she was growing up in the 1850s, in the decade before the Civil War. She was living in North Carolina, and indeed, it was a slaveholding state. And in Washington, North Carolina, there were some plantations, and Susan was aware that not only was there slavery in her town, but that because of the fugitive slave law, which required if a slave escaped north, it had to be returned, there were ads in her dad's paper on a regular basis. $50 reward, run away from the subscriber near Poctolis, Pitt County, Negro woman, Winnie, about 22 years old, etc. So these horrendous ads that were describing individual human beings as you know, as property or possession, which is what slavery was about. So again, that was her dad's newspaper. And we know as a fact from studying the census that Susan's family had enslaved people working at the hotel. Now, it was only like a half a dozen of them, and it wasn't like being out in a plantation in the heat, but it was still an inhuman thing. And we know that Susan absorbed this and started questioning the life that she was in the middle of. What's interesting is she was also aware from her dad's paper and reality of what people said in town that there were fugitive slaves escaping, freedom seekers trying to get out via the port. And one of the things we've discovered is that her town not only was a slaveholding town, but it was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And one of the reasons they were able to get away with it, in 1860, the population of Washington was 45% free white, 45% enslaved black, and 10% free black. And a lot of the African Americans, whether enslaved or free, worked on the waterfront. They were sailors, they were shipbuilders, ship caulkers, sail makers, all the various things that are done if you're a portside town. So at any given time, you would see a group of people there, and you wouldn't necessarily know if the people working were slaves or free. And that was one of the things that made it possible to sneak out. There might be a free African-American sailor, and he would pull someone aside and say, oh yeah, he's a sailor working with me, and then go north and escape. So Susan was aware of all of this happening in her town. And she later said, I was very slow to take on an idea. It wasn't until the age of 8 that I realized the evils of slavery. And then by 11, she outright said, in mixed company, which not all of whom appreciated it, I am an abolitionist, which was a big deal for a kid to be saying, living in her town at that time. Now, the war started in 1861. Within a year, in 1862, the war came to their front doorstep. And actually, Union troops took over Washington, North Carolina, where Susan lived. This is the only image we have that shows her home. And you'll see there it says Lafayette Hotel, and these are Union troops coming in at one point. The Union troops took over many of the buildings in town and insisted, because the Dimock's Hotel was such a nice one, that their officers be put up there. So Susan and her family were living with a bunch of Union officers. They took a lot of flack for that, but there were lots of places simply taken over by the occupying troops. Now, we also know that this was a dangerous time because it wasn't just that the Union troops came in and took over, but Confederate troops were periodically attacking and trying to get the town back. So there were actual battles in Susan's front yard. You know, there were cavalry coming back and forth from the Union and the Confederacy. There were gunfire, there were saber fights, and also from the harbor, there were various gunboats firing shells into town. So it was a dangerous and a really scary time. What was even worse was that Sue's dad was her big supporter in her interest in medicine. Her mom said, I don't know, if you want to do something, why don't you do something like be a teacher if you're studying so much, because that's okay. And her dad said, Sue says she wants to study medicine, and I say she may. But in 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, her dad died. So her number one supporter, who was, there for her, unlike Dr. Zach's dad. And it was devastating. He was not killed in the Civil War. It was some kind of an illness. Back in those days, I found, when I was doing some research down in North Carolina, I found this general store ledger. And what they used to do is they would have an account under your name. And each day when you bought something, they'd write down what it was, how much it cost, and then at the end of the month, you'd pay up. So we actually found her dad's accounts. And there's all kinds of painkillers, alcohol, oils and stuff like that. So we know it was some kind of ailment. We still are not sure what he died of. But we know he wasn't killed in a battle or something. Now, if this wasn't bad enough, after 2 years, the Union troops realized that the Confederates were going to attack it again, and it really wasn't worthwhile staying in town. So they decided to get all their stuff together, get on boats, and leave. However, as they were leaving, the town of Washington caught on fire. Some people said the Union troops lit it. Others say it was a complete accident. We will never, ever know. But anyway, the town just started burning down building by building. And we have first-person accounts of Susan, her mom, her aunt, and other women in town, because so many of the men were out at war, running down with buckets to the river, bringing buckets up and throwing them on the buildings. And between the bucket brigade, a few stone buildings that were fireproof, and the winds dying down, finally the fire stopped. But in less than 2 weeks, a second fire started in the Dimock's backyard. It was completely accidental in the trash area. The rest of the town burned down, including Susan's home. Okay? So we're still in the middle of the Civil War. Susan's dad is gone, her home is gone. What are you going to do? So she and her mom knew that they had relatives in Massachusetts, and that's how we connected. So they decided to try to wend their way north and come up to Massachusetts. And they ended up being in 3 different towns: Sterling, Hopkinton. Now, what is that known for? And Boston. By the way, they weren't running the marathon at that time. Okay. So they started in Sterling because Susan's dad's sister, Maria Dimock Mann, lived in Sterling, and they knew that that was a great place to go, at least to start. So they went to Sterling, Massachusetts. And when Susan got there, she discovered that there were 2 really, really famous people in town. And one of them, on the left, is in the Sterling Museum, was a woman named Mary Sawyer. That is one of her gowns. And another one was Ebenezer Buttrick. Do these names mean anything to anyone? Buttricks? Yes, the patterns, the tissue patterns, okay? So these 2 people, Mary Sawyer was Mary of Mary Had a Little Lamb. Yes, it was a true story. Okay, and Ebenezer Buttrick, as we already mentioned, was the guy that invented tissue paper patterns. What's cool is Mary Had a Little Lamb started as a poem, then it became a song. By the time Susan was born in 1847, it was already popular all over the US. So she may well have grown up singing Mary Had a Little Lamb, and here she was in the same town with Mary. Mary was quite old then, but it's a real story. Now, when I went to Sterling to research this, I traveled extensively to figure out all the things that were happening. The Historical Society had this picture, and I said, "You have a picture of the actual house that Susan went to, her aunt's house?" She said, "Yeah, there it is." And I said, can we go to the site so I can see where it was? And he said, you can't only go to the site, we can go to the house. It's still there. Okay? So we went and we visited, and the woman who owns the house now kindly let us in. And it was a beautiful, colonial house with low ceilings, dark beams, all kinds of wonderful stuff. And she said, yeah, they were abolitionists, and a lot of abolitionists hung out here. And we also think this was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And I went, huh, really, another stop on the Underground Railroad? And she said, yeah, because we were doing some renovations, or about to begin, and knocked on a wall, and it sounded like it was kind of hollow. So we dug into the wall, and we found a hidden staircase that goes up to the attic, and there's little chambers up in the attic and in the chimney area that we have reason to believe fugitive slaves may have hidden. So, so it's interesting that this Underground Railroad keeps following us around. Now, some cool connections happen for Susan here. So in the lower left, we have Dr. Daniel Mann, Maria Dimock Mann, which is Susan's aunt, and niece Susan is there, okay? They're really good friends with another abolitionist family who have a house in Sterling and one in Boston, Colonel William Green and his daughter Bessie. Susan and Bessie become close companions, great friends for life, okay? Bessie discovers that Susan really cares about medicine, and says, I'm going to see if I can do something about that. In the meantime, they're abolitionists and great friends with William Lloyd Garrison, probably the most famous abolitionist in New England. Dr. Daniel Mann is William Lloyd Garrison's dentist, okay? And they all are friends with this other person who's another abolitionist in town, Dr. Marie Zakrzewska. So all of the parts come together. Bessie, through her dad and Garrison, gets to Dr. Zak, says there's this young girl who really loves medicine, is smart, can you give us some books? And little by little the connection begins, and they decide Susan needs to meet Dr. Zak and go see what she can do at that hospital, because it's people who believe that women can be doctors. I don't have a picture of her friend Bessie Green. At the Mass Historical Society, I was able to find a bunch of letters that she'd written, but photos were far rarer at that time. In the Small World Syndrome, Bessie Green's cousin was Robert Gouldshaw. Okay, so it's like, it's too much. Everybody knew or was related to everybody. Okay, now, what they needed to do was, they needed to get stability, and they needed to make a living. And this is what connected them with Hopkinton. It's hard to know nowadays because none of this is left, but Hopkinton at that time in the 1860s was a huge place for shoe and boot factories. They were all over town, giant places like this, but there are many, many of them. And that meant that there were a lot of laborers in town working in the shoe factory, and a great new labor force had an influx into Boston. Does anyone know what that labor force was? The Irish, yeah. So gazillions of Irish boot and shoemakers working here. And Mrs. Dimock said, these guys need a place to live. There's going to be shoe salesmen coming in and out of town. I know how to run a hotel. So she decided to do that. So she ran this hotel right on the main street in Hopkinton, had a shoemaker living there with her and his family, and catered to other people. This building actually was there up until the 1990s, and then it was torn down, so I never got to see that actual building. But she started doing the same thing. Now, interestingly enough, we were able to find in the mass census who lived in that hotel at the time, and we see Mrs. Dimock and Susan's aunt and her cousin. Here's Michael Reagan and his family. Note, Michael Reagan is from Ireland, and he's a bootmaker, okay, classic. But then we found two other names, went, whoa, okay? We found Ellen Dimock and Louis Dimock, teenagers, 16, 13. And it says BLK, black, yeah. It turns out, after much research, this took us more than a year to put the pieces together, that they had been enslaved by the Dimocks in Washington. They brought them up with them, which meant that they were automatically free because it was still during the Civil War. So all of a sudden, all of this Underground Railroad stuff starts to make sense. And they were living freely with the Dimocks after that. Susan wanted to help out financially, so she actually decided that she would teach at a local school in Hopkinton. But she did it for a few months, and she just kept saying, she kept getting these books from her friend Bessie, from Dr. Zach, and it was like, Mom, I really want to be a doctor. So her mom said, okay, I think you really want to do that. Why don't you go connect? So she was allowed in as kind of an intern, okay? Susan had not graduated from high school, had not gone to college, had not gone to med school, but she knew more than anybody else. And so she was allowed in, and she excelled. She was working under the other women doctors, helping everybody at the hospital, learning stuff all the time. And so two of the women doctors there, Zach and Dr. Sewell, said, you know what? You are so smart and so talented. We want you to go to a real, legitimate, high-end med school. We want you to go to Harvard. Okay, so she applied. It was 1867. And this is, by the way, this is what the hospital looked like where she was in downtown Boston. And she got this letter back from Harvard. I've underlined the important part. No provision has been made or now exists for the education of women in any department of the university. Okay? Susan was not the first nor the last woman to apply and be told you can't come because you're a woman. This is 1867. Does anyone know when Harvard Med allowed women in for the first time? 1945. So if Susan had waited till she was 98, she could have applied, okay? Now, I want to say that Harvard was the worst, okay? There were lots of other schools that went co-ed long before Harvard did. How many people went to Harvard here? Oh, so can we knock it a little? Okay. It was better in other departments. He's smiling. Okay. Okay, so they still thought, okay.
Yale first.
Anyway, when that failed, Dr. Zach and Sewell both heard that there was an experiment going on in Zurich, and that there were a whole lot of progressives and even radicals at the University of Zurich, and they had decided they were going to do an experiment and let a few women in to the med school alongside the men, okay? So Susan wrote to them, and she was very forthright. In the second paragraph, she says, I should like to know, in the first place, if women, when received into the medical school, have in all respects equal advantages with other students. In other words, are you going to stick me in the back of the room, or are we going to be there with the guys? And they said, no, you're right here. We're going to let you in. And she was accepted. And this is what Zurich looked like. She arrived in 1868. Friends from the hospital put money together so she could take the transatlantic voyage, so she could, to pay for tuition and so on. And when I went to Zurich to find out more about her experience there, this was the entrance to the med school when Susan was there. And when I arrived, it looked just the same. It's pretty cool, when you can walk into history and go, wow, this is where Susan went. Now, the class was, there were 42 guys in the class and 7 women. And the 7 women got to be known as the Zurich 7. And they were known all over Europe and then later in America because it was a big deal to allow these women to come into a really high quality medical school. And here are some of the images. I was able to find all of them except one, a portrait. You can see they were from around the world: Russia, Wales, US, England, Switzerland, Scotland. And each one of these women went to med school, got equal opportunities with the guys, studied, right next to them, worked with them. It was fine. It worked out just fine. Everything people were worried about was not a worry. They said at the time that it took an average of 5 years to finish the medical school. Susan finished in 3. And each one of these women went back after graduating to their respective country and basically became a rock star, became a really important physician and helped other women get into medical schools. So there was a huge change from this. And this was well known around the world. One of some of their classmates really loved Susan. They said, she grew up in the South, then she was in the North in Boston, that she had a mixture of Yankee grit and Southern charm. So that helped her get through a lot of stuff. Her classmate and best friend there said, "The American is a remarkably accomplished person for her age. She seems so soft and childlike, and yet her whole manner is one of decisiveness in her thinking and acting." So again, she impressed everyone. Now, at that time, there were no dormitories. So what students did was, when they went to school in a European country, they would try to find a family from their home country that they could rent a room from. And after a bit of research, we discovered that Susan stayed with this guy's family, Aaron Lufkin Dennison. And I went, "That's nice." And I went, wait a sec. He was from Waltham. And he was not only from Waltham, but he was the guy that founded the Waltham Watch Factory. Why was he in Switzerland? Watches. Okay, so she had a very, very famous landlord. Anyway, I was able to see, going in the various archives in Zurich, papers Susan had written, studies she had done, her dissertation. Now, can anyone read any of this? Can you see the language? Okay, it's all in German. Okay, because all the classes were in German, all her papers were in German, and therefore Susan taught herself German and graduated with honors. Okay, did I mention she was weird? Okay, okay. I actually, at one of the archives, they said, "Do you want to see her diploma?" And I said, "Sure." And I got to pick up and hold her diploma and took a photo of it. And then I said, "Wait, why do you have her diploma?" Now, all of these things were hand printed at that time, okay? And they said, "Yeah, the students, you know, they always, you know, like a few years later say, 'Oh, I've lost my diploma, can I get another one?' So we always make sure we print 2 copies of it for when they do that." So they actually had the second copy right there of her diploma. Susan, after graduating, could have gone back to the US and practiced. You didn't have to do a residency. You didn't have to do an internship back then. Actually, there were doctors in the US who didn't go to med school. So some people said, you didn't have to go to med school either. That got cleared up by the end of the century. But what she wanted to do, she wanted to make sure she had learned everything she could in Europe. And so after leaving Zurich, she went to both Vienna and to Paris to see other doctors, see other hospitals, sit in on classes, and learn as much as she could. And one of the things she did was in Vienna. Do we have any surgeons here? Any surgeons? Okay. The surgeon's surgeon, the George Washington of surgeons around the world that everybody looks back to, is a guy named Theodore Billroth. And Susan wanted to see him work because he was just known around the world for doing things that nobody else dared do and doing them beautifully. So she wanted to watch him in Vienna. But the other thing she picked up from him and from another guy there, Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis, was this weird thing that doctors should wash their hands. Okay? This was a time when many doctors, perhaps most doctors, okay, would go from dissecting a cadaver to delivering a baby and not clean up in between, okay? And people wondered, why is it that women who were giving birth were doing better if they were home alone than if they were in the hospital? It was true. It was true. So these guys, germ theory had been discovered but had not been proven. And those people who were talking about it, like Semmelweis, were mocked. And so people didn't really know about germs yet. It wasn't another 10 or 20 years before they could scientifically prove it. He said, "I just know that things end up better when you wash your hands." Okay? Anyway, so this was something important that Susan picked up there. The other thing is she impressed the doctors. She took classes that, you know, she didn't have to take. And one of them in Vienna said, "The question whether a woman can be fit for the study and practice of medicine has been definitely answered by the appearance of Dr. Susan Dimock." So again, impressing people around the world. Now the deal was, her friends had paid her to go over there, her friends and her mom, who kept working and sending her money. But the deal was, she had to come back to Boston and become, for 3 years, the resident physician at the New England Hospital for Women and Children. So she came back to Boston. And this is what it looked like. This is Beacon Street going up Beacon Hill. Except for the road surface, it really looks the same, okay? The same buildings on the left, the same Boston Common on the right, but it was still a dirt road at that time. And there was public transportation, but it was still all horse-drawn. So we did have a trolley system, but everything was horse-drawn in Boston. Individual horses, horses in teams pulling trolleys and carts and everything else. The other thing in Boston was in the 4 years she'd been gone, there were a lot of women who were doing things they weren't supposed to be doing. A lot of women getting out of that women's sphere and going into the public sphere. For example, when she left, the woman in the upper right was a writer, okay? But was a writer, okay? But when Susan came back, she was one of the most famous writers in the world. This was Louisa May Alcott, and Little Women had come out while Susan was gone. In the lower left, Julia Ward Howe. Before Susan left, she'd already written Battle Hymn of the Republic, but by the time Susan got back, Julia Ward Howe was big in suffrage. She was creating women's clubs. She was doing all kinds of enterprises, making it possible for women to enter the public sphere. So a powerful woman. In the upper right, Lucy Stone, probably the most important suffragist in all of New England, equally important to Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She had begun a magazine in 1870 while Susan was gone called the Women's Journal, which was the most important suffrage paper in the United States. And in the lower right, a woman named Ellen Swallow, later Ellen Swallow Richards, who became the first woman admitted to MIT. And after she graduated, she opened it up and created opportunities for other women. So all of these women were doing inappropriate things in Boston. And so it was a really amazing over that 4-year period that Susan came back to this and got a lot of support for what she was doing. The other big thing that happened was the New England Hospital in downtown had proved so important that people had fundraised, gotten together, and they had moved to what is the current place where the Dimock Center is today, to this beautiful 9-acre campus in Roxbury. Now we have to remember that Roxbury was like the wilderness at that time. There were some wealthy white people living in mansions, but a lot of it was open land, trees, fresh air. And one of the reasons they went there, the land was cheaper than downtown Boston, but the big thing is that there was clean air, trees, light, sun, and in downtown Boston it was filthy. It was really dirty. And people said, you know, we don't know why, but people seem to get better when there's light and air. Okay, so again, germ theory is still trying to catch up. Okay, so she came back to become a resident physician. The hospital building looked like this that she came back to. Today, it looks like this. It's still there. It's called the Zakshevska building or the Z building. It was a gorgeous big building with large rooms. Again, light and air were very, very important. Large rooms, big open hallways, lots of fresh air coming in. By the way, the architects who did this, it was a team called Cummings and Sears. Willard Sears, about 2 decades later, created something you may know better, Mrs. Gardner's Fenway Palace. That would be the Gardner Museum. Same architect, same architect. So anyway, so Susan began her medical residency. She became the resident surgeon. She was the resident physician, surgeon. She taught the students, the interns. She taught what nurses were there. She lived at the hospital. And this is before we get into what she did, they were about to have the grand opening and wanted everybody from downtown to come out to Roxbury to celebrate the grand opening of this new hospital building. But something happened. All the horses got sick. Okay, this was called the Great Epizootic. It was an equine flu that came down from Canada and within basically about 2 weeks infected 75% of all the horses in New England and then kept spreading through the United States. The horses were at least ill, many of them died. And this was a big deal because it's all horse-drawn transportation. So they said, we need to put off the opening because nobody can even get out to Roxbury because we need the horses to take people out there. So they put off the opening, got ready, and then the town burned down. And it was a rough fall in Boston in 1872. The Great Fire of 1872. Luckily, the New England Hospital didn't burn down because they were out in Roxbury, and this was in downtown Boston. Okay, so finally they got to have the opening. and had this gorgeous, gorgeous campus. Today, that building, the beautiful high Victorian building, there's lots of other buildings there as well, but that was the first of all the buildings. And they had, again, modern, spacious, clean areas for people to work in. And because they were a women's hospital, they often had baskets of babies. And this is an actual photo of the maternity ward. And what's interesting is because Susan came back with this nutty hand washing idea and everybody agreed with it, they had just so many better stats than any of the hospitals in Boston, the other ones where they weren't washing their hands and didn't have fresh air and stuff. So it became the place for people to give birth and for women to get care. Since Susan had come from the slaveholding South and her family even had enslaved laborers, it was a big deal that her first maternity patient was an African-American woman. And Susan apparently had brought a doll with her that she escaped the South with, the fire and everything. And her first maternity patient, she gave that doll to, and she became a godmother to that. And this became kind of a microcosm for the hospital, that they would treat people of all socioeconomic levels, people of all races and backgrounds, and not all the hospitals did that. So it was a big deal and a really important precedent. Meanwhile, oh, by the way, so Susan's running the hospital. She's 25, okay? And so here are some descriptions of her at that time. She's 25, resident physician. She's the chief surgeon. She's, as far as we can tell, the most skilled woman surgeon in the United States in 1872. Tactful, talented, genius, quiet, calm, modest, self-reliant. And this is a big deal at the last line. She's proving that a woman can live according to her taste, be thorough and scientific in her work, and yet remain a lady. There's not something wrong with you, the fact that you want to be a doctor, even though some people thought there was something wrong with you. Another big deal, because of Bill Roth and the people she met in Europe, she learned that thermometers were really important in tracking a patient's health. That if you knew if a person's temperature was going up or down, you could tell if what you were doing was really succeeding or helping. Now, these aren't ordinary thermometers. They were a foot long. They went under your armpit, and they had to stay there for 15 minutes, okay? But the other thing is, you needed to not only do this, you needed to track it, right? And there was no Staples or Office Max with graph paper, and so every night, Susan would send her students, the people working under her, with their pencils and papers, and they would hand draw graphs so that they could take the temperatures each day for each patient and track how they were doing. Again, it made a huge difference in the wellness of the patients. Now, even though the tools of the trade were quite primitive back then, like little scalpels like this, Susan did some amazing surgeries. This is one that was so amazing that they had a photographer come in to do before and after pictures. Little 7-year-old girl from Nantucket came in. Can you see the tumor on her neck? Yeah. So they were using ether anesthesia, and Susan incised like 71 little lobules inside that, sewed her back up. The kid survived. It was a big deal. It was written up in medical journals everywhere. This is just one example of like, wow, a woman's doing this? This is amazing. So it was huge. One of her supporters, there were several doctors, Harvard med doctors, who really supported the hospital and said, we love what you're doing. This is great. We really need to integrate and have more women in the system. Dr. Samuel Cabot, it was not merely her skill that was remarkable, but also her nerve that qualified her to become a great surgeon. So now, Susan had learned while she was in Europe that nursing was really, really important for the progress of any kind of patient. Among the people who had told her that were Bill Roth, and she actually had met Florence Nightingale and talked with her. And nursing was not a profession. That's the easiest way I can say it. Susan came back and said, okay, there's a little kind of ad hoc nursing program at the hospital, a little kind of informal training, but I want to create an actual nursing school with a program, a curriculum, tests, lectures, different types of nursing. So she created a year-long nursing program at the New England Hospital, which was the first professional nursing school in the United States. That happened in Roxbury, okay? So here are the nurses. Now, the thing that Susan had to do was convince people that nice girls could become nurses. Okay? It's hard to imagine, because nursing is such a revered profession today, that basically people who went into nursing tended to be someone who was desperate, okay, like a widow who had no money and didn't know what to do, or someone who was suddenly impoverished, or, well, okay, an example, in Bellevue Hospital in New York, what they would do is go to the local prison and talk to the prostitutes and say, you can stay in prison or you can be a nurse, okay? That's why I have that little diagram on the right. Okay, so Susan spent a lot of time going to nice families with nice girls who might be going to Wellesley or other lovely schools, and say, nice families, nice girls, this is a real profession and we're going to treat it that way. And she wasn't the only person doing this, but she was an important link in this becoming a respected, nice, excellent profession, which it hadn't been before, with serious training and degrees and all that. She set up a whole lecture series with different doctors coming in. People got so excited that people from the outside wanted to come in and go to the lectures. And she taught and graduated the first professional nurse in the United States, a woman named Linda Richards, who's such a big deal in the history of nursing that her diploma and her uniform are at the Smithsonian, okay? And she went on to create nursing schools in the United States, in Japan, and so again, the beginning of the professional modern age of nursing. Another thing was, at the school, they graduated the first trained African-American nurse in America, Mary Eliza Mahoney. Now, one thing that was interesting, if you look at a lot of literature, books, magazines, journals in the 19th century, you will see these words used a lot. That women who try to be in the public sphere, there's something wrong with them. They're manly, they're unsexed. When one reporter was going to visit the Blackwell sisters in New York, he admitted that he thought when he arrived that they were going to have beards. What can I say? What can I say? So Susan kind of threw them off. She wasn't the only person, but she was among those, because everything, all the stuff describing Susan, feminine, sweet voice, gentle, ladylike, is like, it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. Again, she wasn't the only person, but she was one that said, I don't have to have a beard to be a doctor. I have to say, though, although she was ladylike and sweet, she worked really hard, and one of her patients said she rolled her hospital like a Napoleon. Again, it's that Southern charm and Yankee grit that she used to her advantage. So she was tough, but very, very gentle. So they expected this and got this, okay? That's actually Susan with her pet spaniel, Dottie. Now, because they focused on women, it's unbelievable, but during Susan's time when she was the resident physician, this is 1872 to 75, the New England Hospital was the only one in Boston that had obstetrics, gynecology, and pediatrics under one roof. So in many of the other hospitals, it didn't happen for another 20, 30, 40 years. Now, what happened was, Susan, for doing all the stuff she was doing at the hospital and living there, she was paid $300 a year. Now, it's a different financial system than we have now. The lowest paid public school teacher in Boston at the same time was paid $600 a year. And I know as a fact, since I'm the house historian at the Parker House, that the chef at the Parker House was paid $5,000 a year.
What?
Okay? So.
Back then?
Oh yeah, he was a really good chef. Okay. But she was a really good surgeon, okay? Okay? So what she did, because she wanted to pay back everybody who'd given her the money, to go to school and to go to Europe, she had a private practice on the side. So she would do all the stuff at the hospital, then go to downtown Boston, or treat really wealthy people, make a bunch of money, and in 2.5 years she had paid all her loans off. Okay? College loans, that's a topic. Okay, so she said, I need a break. They said, Susan, we really want you to be the resident physician for another 3 years. She said, I'll do that, but I need a break. I am so burned out. So she wanted to go back to Europe, visit her, because she had buddies spread all over Europe because of school and everything. But I also want to buy a bunch of medical instruments because they make much better instruments there. In the 19th century, Europe was far ahead of America in medicine. That flipped in the 20th century. But she wanted to go buy stuff. So she decided to go. And she wrote to a doctor, a very famous woman doctor in London, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. They were kind of mutual fans. That she just felt so lucky. She was coming across, and this is an actual letter Susan wrote. As for me, I have not one wish unfulfilled. Nay, I am so fortunate. And we already know some of the tough times she's been through, but she thought she was just very fortunate. So she and her best pal, Bessie, as well as another woman who had studied nursing under Susan, went down to New York, got tickets on SS Schiller, which was this very modern German boat, ironclad, and they decided to take a vacation and go across the Atlantic. And the first few days were lovely. I just imagined they were playing shuffleboard and just having a wonderful, wonderful time. But, okay, at that time, when you're crossing the Atlantic, generally you come across from New York and you aim for the English Channel. And therefore, the ship can drop people off in England, they can drop them off in France, keep on going to Germany, and take people everywhere. But the problem is there's all kinds of weird currents coming in. You're coming out of the deep sea into a gentler sea. You've also got currents coming here and down there. So it can get really dicey, okay? One of the things is there's a group of little islands off of Cornwall, okay, called the Scilly Islands, or the Isles of Scilly. And they're great if you're getting lost, because there's a bunch of islands. There's a lighthouse that can make sounds and has light. There are also bunches of islands. If you have any kind of trouble, you can stop there on the way. However, if the weather's bad, it's not so good. And this is a photo taken by a photographer I met while I was in Cornwall doing research there. And he said, are the waves here intense? Oh yeah, okay? And this is a modern day photo, a sample of the waves in that area, how horrendous they can be, okay? So the ship is coming into this and there's a lot of problems, okay? I already mentioned the currents coming from all over the place. The seas and the waves started getting higher and higher and higher. The ship was foundering. They got into what they call locally a pook, which is just an intense fog that you just can't see through. Why is that a problem? Because the way they know where they are is by looking at the sun and the stars. This is 1875, okay? And so they had very limitations navigationally. The hull of the ship was iron, great, but that meant, it turned out, it threw off the compass because of the iron. The compass didn't know what it was doing. There was a deafening sea roar. They were hoping they would see Bishop's Rock's lighthouse, but they couldn't see anything, they couldn't hear anything either way. As the waves started coming, they got ledged on what's called the Retarier Reef, and it kept slamming against them. 6 of the 8 lifeboats got smashed completely, and then it got dark. It was really, really bad. They were that close to the lighthouse and didn't even know it. And again, this is them sending off flares, hoping that someone would see them. We need help, we need help. This is really, really bad. They were actually caught on a ledge, and it was low tide. And so some of the people on board said, well, when it gets to be high tide, we'll just float away, we'll be okay. What they didn't know is there was a hole in the hull. So they kept telling people to come up from steerage, 3rd class, 2nd class, come up because the water's coming in. And as the people came up to the top, these giant waves kept blowing people off. Okay, it was a bad wreck. There were 372 passengers and crew. Of those in this wreck, only 37 survived. One woman, not Susan. Okay? And this is one of the reasons, this is the title of my book. This whole idea of let's take care of the women and children first is very 20th century. It's very Titanic, 1912, but this is 1875. And it was much more in that era, every man for himself. And as a matter of fact, the bulk of the people who survived were crew, including guys who knew how bad it was, who lashed themselves to the masts so they wouldn't get blown off. There was no definite consideration given to the women and the children. And when Boston and people, friends around the world, finally realized, Dr. Cabot, her good friend, said, this community will never know what a loss it has in Dr. Dimock. Susan Dimock was 28. Okay. So everybody in Boston wanted her back. And so some of her friends, because she had friends around the world, came down from London and went there. They found her body like the day after the wreck, just floating there. And they embalmed her, and then a friend came over on a steamer from the US and brought her body back to America, back to Boston, because they wanted their beloved doctor back. One of the things they did was one of her friends at the hospital collected a bunch of the letters she had written, the obituaries, wrote a brief bio, and put this together as a memoir of Susan Dimock, which up until my book was the only other book ever written about Susan. And it was an invaluable resource, a very slim volume. Probably more important to Susan is they instituted a free bed at the hospital, which meant that if someone applied, it was an endowed bed, they would get complete health care if they were there days, weeks, months in the Susan Dimock free bed. Over in Jamaica Plain at Forest Hill Cemetery, they had a ceremony and made a beautiful stone for her, and she was buried there. They commissioned a portrait painter to make a portrait of her. And the street the hospital was on was called Codman Street, but they renamed it Dimock Street in her honor. Back down in her hometown, they set up, this is when I was, who is that? They set up, they did a commemorative sign where her Lafayette Hotel, where she lived, used to be. And they also named a street for her. And when I went down there, I went, wow, it's even Susan Dimock Street. And they went, no, that's South Dimock. Okay, there's a South Dimock and a North Dimock. But anyway, so they did that. The New England Hospital started in 1862. It lasted 107 years. But it basically was a victim of its own success, okay? Even by the early 20th century, women were being allowed into medical schools. Harvard took a little longer than some of the others. And a lot of women were working in hospitals. And therefore, by '69, they really couldn't compete. There were a lot of high-end hospitals in Boston. But they wanted to still serve the community, which had changed substantially. And so they made it the Dimock Community Health Center. Today it's just known as the Dimock Center. But it's still serving people. Today it's largely an African-American community, but they're still serving people who are not served by other hospitals. And so their purpose in many ways, even though the clientele has changed, has remained the same. And here's the Dimock Center today. And of the legacies that Susan left behind, as it says here, that, you know, it's one thing for a woman to become a midwife or even maybe a physician, but the idea that a woman could become a surgeon, Susan really changed what people thought about that. She was really, really important. And neither she nor Dr. Zach were ever admitted into the Massachusetts Medical Society. But when they finally let women in, every single one was a doctor from the New England Hospital for Women and Children. And then in the 20th century, when the American College of Surgeons was invented, the first 5 women in that were all from the New England Hospital. So they were a vital tool, not the only one, but a vital tool in the creation in the equality of women and men. Today, more than half of all med students are women. And Susan was an important pioneer in getting us from here to there. And that is the story of Susan Dimock. A question.
How many doctors are women? 50% of students.
But it does fall down, and for obvious reasons, right? So even though more of the students are women doctors today, some of them drop out. They have families. They have they have kids, and men drop out less with families and kids than
And
women.
what's the story with male nursing?
Yeah.
That's a flip too.
That's a flip too, and that took a lot of, there was, in our lifetime, men were chastised for becoming nurses. What's wrong with you? It's almost the flip of women being manly and unsexed. You must be feminine or something.
Are they significant percentage now?
I don't know does anyone know what the percentage of male nurses is today? But again, they had the same kind of prejudice, like no. Yeah, it's crazy. Any other questions? Any other questions? Yes.
My husband was a patient at Dimock Hospital.
Oh, wow.
Years ago.
Okay, anyone here, her husband was a patient at Dimock. Anyone born at the New England Hospital for Women and Children? Yes? You were born there? I love that. I love that. I love that. Oh, by the way, should you be interested in any more, this is the bold-faced advertisement, okay? Should you be interested, you can get my book everywhere, like in all those places. I also have some here. If you're interested at all, I'd be happy to sign them. Yes, question?
Can women who drop out because of having families re-enter
Of course.
medical profession?
Sure. But depending on how long you're out, you may have to take other courses.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly, but we're desperate for people in healthcare today, so, Well, during the pandemic, so many people retired early, burned out, dropped out. Yeah. So anyone who wants to be a doctor or nurse. Yes?
I forget what the reference to Linda Richards was.
Yes.
I think there is a Linda Richards building. It used to be at Boston City Hospital. Am I incorrect in that, or is it at Brigham? Maybe?
Well, there is one at the New England, there is one at the Dimock Center. But Linda, she started nursing programs in other places. I'm almost sure she started the one at MGH. So that would make sense.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because she started one in Japan. She went over and just said, okay, professional nursing's a big deal. Let's start everywhere.
Yeah, I'm a nurse, and I worked at Boston City, my friend Lorraine, too.
There you go.
And for some reason, I remember a Linda Richards building. I think it was where the nurse.
And there may be more than one.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Excellent, thanks.
How
Another
many
question?
nurses are here tonight?
How many nurses are here today? Wow, nice. Thank you.
Our guardian angels.
Our guardian angels. I'm glad they didn't drag you out of prison. Yeah.
That's why nurses get a bit.
How many doctors are here? How many doctors are here? Still working on it? They're all working, yeah. Okay. Great. Yes.
You had things that she wrote, you read letters by her.
Yes.
What
Repeat.
kind of a voice does she have? How does she come across?
It's hard to, okay, the question was, what I read many of her letters. It's amazing to sit and hold a piece of paper that she wrote. It's hard to say because so much of the stuff she wrote was kind of recounting stuff. Like when she was in Europe in school, she would write back to Dr. Zach and tell about all her classes and stuff like that. Would have more, it would be more formal and recounting stuff. I don't remember reading any letter that said I feel or I fear or that kind of personal type of stuff. It doesn't mean they don't exist, but I didn't find them. Yeah. So, but she was very humble. She was very matter of fact. When people would criticize her or the hospital, like for being women or whatever, she would kind of just, the Nike slogan that's on T-shirts, "Just do it." That's kind of her. It's like, okay, you can complain. I'm just going to do this surgery. I'm just going to study with these people, that kind of thing. So she was, but she had we know from accounts that she had a very calming, soothing kind of low voice with a little bit of a southern accent. Like we said, she was sweet, sensitive, and ruled like a Napoleon. Yeah.
Did she ever get engaged or anything?
She worked 24/7. And so did she ever get engaged? We know of a guy like at school who was madly in love with her, but she was too busy getting stuff done. But at that time also, a lot of women in professions chose not to marry because they just didn't feel they could do both. And given her schedule, you know, how could she have, I mean, she had a cat and a dog, but she couldn't have had kids, you know, not the way that she was working. So it was her life was her profession. Yeah.
Triple alpha female.
Yeah, triple alpha female. I like that. I like that. Yes.
As far as the male nurses are concerned, my daughter is a nurse practitioner, and she's worked with a couple of male nurses, and their story was almost the same as the women in medical school. They had a family and stuff, and all of a sudden they decided they couldn't finish it.
Yep.
They didn't want to give it up totally.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Very interesting. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you. You're a great audience. Okay.
Great lecturer.
Thank you. Who am I making this out to?